Hello. In what has now become a weekly event, I'm coming to you with some ideas on how we can move forward as individuals and as a society in the wake of a bitter and divisive election season. Today, I'd like to share with you a few thoughts about polarization and what I believe is one step we could take toward reversing what has become a decades-long trend in our society. And that step is proximity. Polarization and proximity. Several weeks ago, I read from Brene Brown's book, Braving the Wilderness, and there were several times that Brown used the word sort. Brown got the term from Bill Bishop's book, The Big Sort. Bishop's a journalist. He wrote this book with the assistance of a retired university professor, Robert Cushing. Bishop had been a journalist and written for small town newspapers in Kentucky and Texas before he and his wife moved to Austin. Initially, Bishop and Cushing were curious about migration patterns in the United States, and their focus was on the economics of these patterns. They were looking at trends from 1970 to 2000. But migration is nothing new in this country. Southern blacks migrated to Chicago in the 1950s. White folks from Appalachia, my kinfolk, took the Hillbilly Highway up to Detroit and Cleveland after World War II. These were migrations in response to economic hardship and opportunity. The movements from 1970 to 2000, though, were different. The flows were selective and they were varied by personal characteristics. People were sorting and the movements themselves were changing economies. But in the process of looking at the mountains of data they gathered, they discovered something else. In 1976, the year that Jimmy Carter ran against Gerald Ford, 26% of U.S. counties were landslide counties. That's where one candidate beat the other by at least 20 percentage points. 16 years later, in 1992, the number of landslide counties had risen to 37.7%. By 2000, that number had risen to 45.3%, and in 2004, it had risen to 48.3%. Fast forward 8 years to 2012, and the percentage of landslide counties had risen to 50.6%. Now, over half of Americans were living in counties that were landslide counties. 4 years later, in 2016, that number had risen to 60.4%. Now, you remember that election. The Electoral College went one way, the popular vote the other way in what was an extremely close election. But in that year, 2016, 6 out of 10 Americans lived in a landslide county. Here's what Bishop wrote. People are finding communities that fit their values, where they don't have to live with neighbors or community groups that might force them to compromise their principles or their tastes. He continued, as people seek out the social settings they prefer, as they choose the group that makes them feel the most comfortable, the nation grows more politically segregated. And the benefit that ought to come from having a variety of opinions is lost to the righteousness that is the special entitlement of homogeneous groups. According to Bishop, the motivating force for this new wave of migration is comfort. People are looking for places, neighborhoods, relationships in which they feel comfortable. They are surrounded by people just like them. Now, there are all sorts of factors that contribute to the polarization that has beset our country, and we might talk about some of those in later episodes. But this act of sorting is surely one very significant factor. Here's a quote from the Wall Street Journal, November 10 this year. If it feels like Republicans and Democrats are living in different worlds, it's because they are. There are few places left in America where one tribe of voters is likely to encounter the other. Predominantly white rural areas are solid Republican. Urban areas are dominated by Democrats. In Philadelphia County, for example, 81.4% of the votes were cast for Joe Biden. I could not find statistics for landslide counties for 2020 yet, but they will come out soon, and I would imagine that the number would be about the same, or maybe even higher. In about 40 years, the United States has become more and more segregated politically. In these safe zone environments, we can we construct, we talk amongst ourselves, and not surprisingly, what we hear from our friends and neighbors sounds familiar and comforting. Our beliefs and ideas are affirmed in the words of our conversation partners. What we say makes sense to them, and what they say makes sense to us. Let me quote Bishop again. And the benefit that ought to come from having a variety of opinions is lost to the righteousness that is the special entitlement of homogeneous groups. So what happens is that we speak to others like us about people like them. Polarization is a natural result. How can we reverse this and begin to walk back from the precipice at which we find ourselves? The answer, and I'm just going to mention it briefly in this video, is proximity. Rather than talking to others like us about people like them, it is time for us to begin respectfully engaging them, the other. It is time for us to sit down with people who hold different views than our own and begin the process of genuine conversation and dialogue. We'll talk more about these conversations in the next video, but let me give you a few first suggestions. Number one, listen more than you talk. Number two, ask questions in an attempt to understand. I hope that you found this helpful. If you found it so, I would encourage you to share it with others. Thank you for your time. Have a great day.